And that's what they're supposed to do. But they're supposed to do that without stopping what they're doing, so that they're living the way they're supposed to. But they're supposed to have the heart behind living that way. And so what he's calling them to do is to return to the spirit that sort of inspires that, rather than having the empty works. He says, if not, I will come to you and remove your lamp from its place. Now remember, the lamps represent the church, and so the punishment is that this community then will be moved outside the church. In the book of Revelation, as well as in the epistles, we find the use of the word church, singular, to be the entire entity, and the word churches, plural, to be, the individual communities. And so what he's talking about is the individual community, the church, will be removed from the church as a global organization, and that sort of thing. And he says, you do have this to your credit. You hate the works of the Nicolaitans, as I do. We're going to mention the Nicolaitans several times in the text, and there's several theories on who they might be, and there's absolutely no basis for any one of the theories. There's simply a guess. We know that there was something wrong. We know the principal problem in the church at this time because we know it from other Johannine literature. And the principal problem in the church at this time was a group of people who denied the divinity of Jesus. But whether or not that's this particular problem, we don't know. We do know the Nicolaitans are a very strong group. They appear in many of the letters, and that they are vehemently opposed by John. So John is trying to militate people against it. And now he concludes with what's going to be the conclusion actually for each of the letters. He says, you have ears, so listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Now, remember, he's talking to the church of Ephesus. So he says, you have ears, you need to listen to what God says to all the churches. Okay? It's kind of like if you and I were to listen to God, for instance. God has what we call generic prohibitions. We call them the Ten Commandments, but we could go through a lot of prohibitions that apply to everyone. God's mandates don't apply to everyone, they apply to individuals. So that God would call one person to be a Franciscan, call another person to get married. Those are two individuals, but neither one of them can murder, okay? And so, although in married, well, anyway, the idea is that in the setting up of the thing to understand that these two kinds of things go on. So he says, you want to hear God's voice to the churches as well. You want to hear what he says to everyone, but particularly what he says to you. And he says, to the victor, I will grant the right to eat from the tree of life that stands in the paradise of God. When we read the book of Genesis, we almost never think in terms of there being two trees. But when you study the scriptures carefully and read Genesis, I think I've mentioned this to you before, that most of the books in the Bible are the combining of several different streams. And when these streams are put together, the genius of the author is to write them in such a way that you don't realize they're separate streams joined. But that's true in all the texts. But anyway, there are two stories in Genesis, and they both concern a tree. One is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the other actually is the tree of life. And they're two separate trees. And in the garden, Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is the sin and everything goes wrong. And patristic authors maintain that they did not eat from the tree of life because there was no fruit on the tree of life. Because the tree of life fruits in the Eucharist. The tree of life is the cross. And when Jesus is crucified on the cross, then the body and blood of Jesus is on the cross. And so then you can eat from the tree of life, and then the tree of life guarantees life. Because if you read the Christian scriptures, it's very clear, anyone who eats my body, drinks my blood, lives forever. So that's the fruit of the tree of life. So he says, if you don't pay attention to what I'm telling you, he says, you'll not be allowed to approach the tree of life, which means no everlasting life. Okay? Now the next, and again, finally, to put this together, against the background of Ephesus and what was happening in Ephesus, he wants them to understand that the glory of Ephesus is not the beauty you see. And believe me, Ephesus was staggering. Today, Ephesus is staggering in its beauty. But Ephesus was staggering, probably more beautiful than Rome. But what made Ephesus great was the harbor. And they were paying attention to all the wonderful things in the city, and they ignored the harbor. And ultimately, everything was gone. And he's saying in the Christian life, when you and I enter into this relationship with Jesus, it's going to inspire us to do all kinds of things as far as caring for the poor. And I would go through 1,000 things that it draws us into. But the fact of the matter is to make sure you preserve the love, not necessarily the things that it calls you into. Because one of the things that happens is that love will choose different expressions as time goes on and this sort of thing. And that you really notice that actually in married life. In married life, the love that binds a husband and wife goes through an evolution of expression. The love does not go through an evolution. Hopefully, the love goes through a growth. But the relationship and how it's expressed goes through an evolution. And what we're supposed to do is preserve the love. Okay? Now a little bit about Smyrna, so you'll know about the city. The most important city in the whole area, actually, from the Roman point of view, is the city of Pergamum. Although none of these are as beautiful or anything as Ephesus, but Pergamum was the center for the Romans. The second thing in importance was the city of Smyrna. And Smyrna is a port, and once Ephesus began to silt up, Smyrna came into importance. One of the very interesting things about Smyrna is that it was one of the very early places that began emperor worship. And they began the worship of the emperor long before other areas in Asia. And the worship of the Roman emperor was a very interesting thing. They built temples, and the temples were basically to Roma. But Roma was the emperor. And I'm sure you're all familiar with busts, like you'd see the busts of the emperors and all that sort of thing. The reason they developed those is that they would have a statue in the temple. It was much easier to replace the head with the new emperor than it was to replace a statue. And that's how they ended up doing busts. They would, replace the neck, and put it in the armor and this sort of thing. But it was really a worship, in fact, of Rome itself. And I don't know if you've ever heard this. It's a very interesting thing if you're curious about this sort of thing. This stuff always I find interesting. There are only 3 countries in all of history that have fostered the worship of country: Rome, the Nazis, and the Americans. That we honor the country as such. And again, only 2 of those were really into flags, the Nazis and us. Okay? That you go to other countries, they can't understand how much we use the flag. They don't at all. And we have the only national anthem ever written about a flag. No one's national anthem refers to their flag. And in the Roman Empire, they particularly in the areas they conquered, they fostered this worship of really Rome itself. And it was in this kind of emperor worship. So this was the place that really took on. And again, they're second only to Pergamum in emperor worship. If you ever get a chance to visit the Archaeological Museum in Berlin, it was in East Berlin for a long time, so you couldn't get there. But if you ever get a chance to go to Berlin, the altar to the emperor is in that particular museum. It was looted by a man by the name of Schliemann. Schliemann was an amateur archaeologist who made some amazing discoveries. He's the man who discovered Troy, for instance. But anyway, I think he discovered the Minoans as well. But anyway, pardon? Oh, okay, Evans. Okay, so this altar, anyway, is probably the most elaborate altar we have from pagan times still existing. And it's in that temple. It is an altar to the emperor. Another interesting thing about Smyrna, there were certain privilege given to the Jewish community, and so there was a large group of Jews living in Smyrna, and they had imperial privileges, certain privileges connected with them. Now, this was really important because, in general, the Jews in the Roman Empire were persecuted. And they were persecuted because their religion separated them from the rest of the community. And the thing that's fascinating to me here is that they would find their protection in this very city where the worship of the emperor was so strong. But anyway, that's kind of the way it worked out. So we're looking now at the letter that was sent to Smyrna. And he says, "To the angel of the church of Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last, who was dead and came to life again." Okay? So we're talking about, these are the words of Jesus, and he cites himself particularly as the one of the first and last. And, you know, you think of emperor worship. Emperor worship is a very powerful thing at a set time. One of the most interesting things, if you ever get a chance to teach kids in school, it's fascinating in school to find out things that were so important to us, so terrifying to us, the kids in school now don't even know existed. An example in my own life is that those of you who are my age will remember how, we knew we were going to be attacked with nuclear weapons by the communists, and we knew exactly how to protect yourself from an atomic bomb. You get under your desk, and it bounces off the top of the desk, I guess, but whatever it is, you get under your desk and you're safe from the atomic bomb. So, and with the whole thing, the crisis that went on in Cuba and everything, if you talk to kids in school now, they don't know what a communist is. Never heard the thing, It's a non-thing to them. Well, that's what he means about being the first and the last. He says, you exist at a set time in history, and a lot of things appear to you to be very powerful and important. They're baloney. It begins with Jesus. It ends with Jesus. Everything else is a fade. Okay? Everything else. But, it's kind of like fog. To fog is really nothing but moisture in the air. Fog is really a nothing. But if you try and drive through it in, around the Fresno area, you'll find out, well, it's really a nothing. It is a very dangerous nothing at that moment. Okay? So anyway, he goes on. He says, I know your tribulation and your poverty. This is a community that was subject to an immense amount of persecution, largely because of the Jewish community. Okay? It says, yet you are rich, and the slander of those who claim to be Jews but are not, they are a synagogue of Satan. The word synagogue and the word church are basically the same word. One's in Hebrew, one's in English. And the word synagogue means congregation, and the word church basically means the congregation. It's peculiar to certain countries, the United States being one of them, that when we say the church, we mean the building. But it's interesting, when the bishops wrote the letter about how to decorate the buildings, they called the letter a home for the church, because the church is the people, not the thing. So it essentially means a congregation. Well, the great danger here with the Jewish community was that because most of the Christians, as they began, were in fact Jews, that when the Christian community was under persecution, the Jews were the ones who knew where they were, knew who they were. Okay? So it was particularly dangerous when the Jewish community was opposed. That's why, like Paul was sent out, out to the other areas. But as Paul became known, then the Jewish community, in those areas would sort of move against him. And he says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And we're going to watch one of the other churches. He'll say, I know how wealthy you are, but you're poor. And the idea of the real wealth is the relationship with God. And in this relationship with God, they are forced to give up their money. I'm sure you're familiar with these texts, if someone takes your coat, give him your shirt. If someone, hits you on the right cheek, turn the left. I could go through a whole bunch of them. Those came about because of the persecution. When the persecution was going on, if someone were to rob from you and you were to take them to court for the robbery, they would say to the judge, you're a Christian. And it wouldn't matter who'd stolen what. You would be punished for being a Christian. So the scriptures warn you, don't take anyone to court under any condition. Whatever they do, ignore it. At least you'll live. Okay? So this is very strong in the text. But people were very much impoverished, and they were impoverished because of the persecution. Under the Roman law, if I turned you in as a Christian, I got half of everything you owned. So the richer you were, the greater the incentive to turn you in. He says, do not fear what you are about to suffer. And I think the thing that is very clear in this is that if you take the traditional thing as we see through the Jewish scriptures, it's the idea that if I'm holy, God's going to prevent the suffering. And that's largely because the Jewish tradition did not have a strong sense of everlasting life. So if there's no strong sense of everlasting life and God is just, I must both be rewarded in this life and punished. Okay, so that has to happen if there's no everlasting life or the justice of God is lost. But it's really interesting here. He does not in any way mitigate that they're going to suffer. He says you are going to suffer. But the key is not to be afraid of it. When you study in psychology, you discover that the great danger to a human being is fear. It's worse than anything we're afraid of. The fear itself. And you know, it's just amazing. I'm sure most of us have phobias of one kind or another. But like if your phobia is spiders, it's amazing your reaction to a spider, as well as you know in your mind, your chances of being killed by a spider, nil. Okay? And it's just remarkable, these terrible, terrible fears we have. But the real danger to a human being is fear. And nothing we fear is as dangerous as what the fear itself will do to us. Okay? They warn you in theology, they warn you never act out of the motivation of fear. Never act from the motivation of fear. If the strongest motivation in your life is fear, don't act. Okay? Try and tone that down before you make a decision. Okay? So he says, for the devil will throw some of you into prison to be put to the test. For 10 days you will suffer tribulation. Now this is the second of the numbers. Remember the first number we came to was 7, which symbolizes, the number 10 symbolizes you can handle it. Represents the 10 fingers. Okay? It's something you can handle. So he says, you're going to be suffer for 10 days. Will they suffer for 10 days? No, the persecution goes on for a long time. But it's symbolic that they can handle it. An example of this is the 10 Commandments. If you read the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, you'll find that there's over 1,000 laws. But we always talk of it as the 10 Commandments. And those books will show how those commandments break down into all kinds of things. But the fact is, we always use the number 10 so that we can handle it. It's the idea you're able to do it. Okay? And I think one of the really important things is to be able to have this knowledge of what you can do. I think one of the peculiar things about a human being is that most human beings can deal a lot more with things than they think they can. When you're faced with it, you can do a lot of things. And it's important for us to really realize that, we are in fact capable of doing these things, no matter how horrible or awful they appear to be at the beginning. He said, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Always know that when we speak in these texts, they always talk of first and second death. First death is where you have physical death. No person can escape first death. It's part of being a human being. The second death is eternal damnation. So they speak of that as the second death. I think it's funny. I don't know if any of you watch any of the the vampire shows, but one of them that goes on is True Blood. And it's really interesting. They talk of the two deaths there. The first death the person gets as a result of it, you end up a vampire. You get bit by a vampire. And the second death is you can be annihilated as a vampire. But they use the first and second death largely as we use it here. And he says, be faithful to death, and I'll give you the crown of life, which means there is no second death. Okay? And he says, if you who have ears, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. The victor will not be harmed by the second death. Okay? Now, largely what's going on here has to do with the thing of the emperor worship. One of the major persecutions going on in the church was that Christians would not be involved in the emperor worship. Now, one of the privileges that the Jews had in this city, quite obviously, or they couldn't be in the city, was the Jews were exempted from emperor worship. Now, the Christian community in this city claimed to be Jewish in order not to be required to worship the emperor. And the Jewish community pointed them out as they are not Jewish, they are Christian. And so it was a part of this huge persecution. Okay, and so this is the particular thing that was going on here. I think you know that the bulk of the major the early church was Jewish initially, and only probably around the year maybe 150, 170. The balance began to tip in favor of the Gentiles. But at the early days of the church, it was largely Jewish. And we did not regard ourselves as non-Jewish. It's kind of like if you were to talk to, let's say, a Jewish person of Jewish ethnicity who was, let's say, a Baptist, they would not cease to refer to themselves as Jewish. They considered themselves Jewish, and they worship in the Baptist church. They may call themselves a fulfilled Jew or something. But as a matter of fact, they don't give up being Jewish. And so that was held. Okay, the next city we talk about is Pergamum. And, incidentally, and we're going to see more of this, one of the things that we would see of this as going through history is the idea of the worship of the emperor, or the influence of politics. One of the things that is very interesting is if you watch historically that politics can have a great influence on religion, and it can be purposefully influencing religion, as it did in Nazi Germany. I think you know that in Nazi Germany, there were Catholics who totally opposed Adolf Hitler as the church was asking them to, and a lot of them ended up in jail. But there were Catholics in Germany who supported Hitler. And there were Protestants in Germany who were completely opposed to Hitler, and there were Protestants who supported Hitler. And they would say, that in order to... It's very difficult in Germany, particularly because of their great belief in obedience. Their belief in obedience hung them in the whole thing when Hitler came to power. But Protestants have a much greater problem with this than Roman Catholics. And the reason why there's a bigger problem for the Protestants is they are not really an international church. Like, for instance, when the Lutheran Church in Germany, which was called the Reformed Church, when it was being pressured by Hitler, there was no one to speak for them. When the Catholic Church was being pressured by Hitler, the Pope in Rome could speak to them, or the bishops in the United States could speak to them, or, that they had voices outside. But that was the particular problem with the Protestant church in Germany. But both the Protestants and the Catholics were split, and there were many in both denominations who really radically supported Adolf Hitler. And the temptation is to kind of support them, just for survival purposes. And we're going to see a little more of this as goes on with one of the churches. With Christianity, you and I always live in kind of a state of compromise. And the question is, how much compromise denies Christianity? And how far can you go and still preserve Christianity? And you really kind of need to work that out. okay? An example is if you're a Catholic in Saudi Arabia, for instance, your services are on Friday because that's when everyone gets off. They go to the mosque on Friday, so Christians will go to the church on Friday. Well, how important is it to worship on Sunday? Well, they decided worshiping on Sunday is really not worth dying for. We can worship on Friday, okay? But everyone in a community needs to kind of work out as those kind of pressures what is worth dying for and what isn't. And an example is in China. That the great difficulty now is to try and get the church back together in China. When the communist government put a lot of pressure on the Catholic Church, there were a lot of Catholics who sided with the government and a lot of Catholics who opposed the government. All the bishops were executed who opposed. But many of the Catholics, were imprisoned and that sort of thing. Those who supported the government, really, you wouldn't know the difference. I was in China when that was going on, and I said Mass in about 11 churches. And the churches I said Mass in, they recognized the head of China, a premier of China. They recognized him as head of their church, okay? But every church I went in had pictures of the Pope. And there's really no difference in the function. They say, you must recognize the premier as head of the church. All right, the premier is the head of the church, okay? Does the premier ever say anything about the Catholic Church? No. Has he ever told people how to worship? No. I mean, you might as well have a statue as head of the church, so it just doesn't matter. But the church then functioned under that. But now the people who suffered so much for their opposition are uncomfortable worshiping with the people who just went through it. And so that's something that really needs to be worked out in China. But anyway, this idea of the compromise with the emperor and how much of the emperor's influence we allow was the thing that was symbolized in this letter to Smyrna. The next one is Pergamum. And as I mentioned, Pergamum was really a very, very important city. And Pergamum, outside Ephesus, I would say the best ruins are in Pergamum. And Pergamum's one of the places where medicine began. They had a temple to, who's this character? Acephalus. And there were 3 or 4 Roman emperors who were healed at this temple. It's an ingenious thing. You go into the temple, and the ruins are all there. You can go through them. You go into this large sort of park-like area, and there's a pool, a sacred pool. And you wash in the sacred pool. Once you wash in the sacred pool, then you go down a tunnel. And as you're going down the tunnel, there are openings all along the tunnel, and the priests would be telling you you're getting better. You feel better as you're going through. And you thought they were the voices of the gods, okay? And once you reach the end, the reason why you thought they were the voices of the gods rather than the priests was they never took a collection. So as you went through, you would hear these voices telling you get better. And then you came into an open area. And in the open area, it was basically the beginning of a hospital, but there were about 9 hospitals, and they had to do with what was wrong with you. And you went in there, and they dealt with different kind of medical things. And because it was one of the first places where they gathered a bunch of doctors together, it actually was one of the greatest advances of medicine possible. It used to be doctors were very individualistic and very separate, and the knowledge that a doctor would gain by practice oftentimes wasn't passed on at all. But here it was. It became a great, great center. But it was also tied to the worship of this god Acephalus. And there was a great temple to Zeus there. It was the first place, actually, to build a temple to Roma. I mentioned Smyrna was the second. But Pergamum was actually the very first to do it, which is probably why Pergamum was eventually made the capital. Pergamum was left to Rome by one of their kings, Attalius III. When he died, he left in his will that all the furnishings of his palace was to go to Rome. Now remember, he's the man who started the worship of the Roman emperor and the thing. So he wanted all the furnishings of his palace, and the Romans considered the entire country the furnishing